Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Today on the Salience Podcast, we turn our attention to the relationship between human factors, systems, and analysis of safety incidents and accidents. As you might imagine, a company with a name like Frontline Mind is intimately involved with frontline action. Agencies and people we specialise in helping work in fast-paced, complex, and at times high-risk environments. Inevitably, there are near misses, incidents, and accidents. How we best learn from these is not straightforward. In fact, when we work with agencies for the first time, we find that most after-action reviews or operational or cold debriefs have made matters worse. Partly, this is because there is an unrealistic focus on events that emerge and are only visible in hindsight. And partly, this is because there is a strong focus on errors and what went wrong. We can see and hear this bias in deficit-based language, where there is a focus on what went wrong. Now, I'm not a fan of an exclusive focus on what went well either. The danger of overdone positivity or staying in happy clappy land is also unhelpful and is just as much of a concern as an obsession with what went wrong. So it's this use of language and the way we can direct attention that I want to focus on today. And to help me unpack how we can learn from near misses, incidents, and accidents without falling into a judgmental binary of good and bad, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Shorrock from Eurocontrol, where he works to support aviation throughout Europe with human factors, applied psychology, and systems thinking and practice. Stephen is a chartered psychologist and human factors specialist. He is editor-in-chief of Hindsight magazine, an adjunct associate professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast Centre for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems. Stephen also writes a blog on human factors and systems. So I first came across Stephen's work in a back copy of Hindsight magazine, where the theme was Just Culture. Just Culture is essentially a system of shared accountability in which organisations apply systems thinking principles to allow fair and just responses to adverse safety events. And more recently, I came across Stephen's work looking at deficit-based language and his efforts to move towards what he describes as neutralised taxonomy. So I'd like to welcome Stephen.
Thank you, Ian. And finally, we've got the chance to catch up. Welcome the invitation. Looking forward to the chat.
Okay, great. Well, I want to dive straight in. But before we start getting into this idea of deficit-based language and neutralised taxonomies, but keeping in mind this idea of, what went wrong, what went well, going right back to your early days, early life experiences, what led you to a PhD in aviation safety all those years ago?
Yeah, it probably makes sense to go back to what led me to psychology as a first degree, because that's like a continuous stream of a sort of special interest. And it's an odd place to start, but where I want to start is that I'm autistic. And from growing up through childhood, I had to work out like peopleese, as I call it, as a sort of second language. So human behavior became a real special interest of mine. Now, I didn't know this until quite recently that I was autistic. I was diagnosed at like 49 years old. But then everything sort of makes sense because I have this intense interest in people, human behavior, and why people did the things that they did. Because to me, I looked at human behavior without the assumptions that other people might look with. To me, it's just people have all these strange patterns and so on. So I was never interested in trains, planes, automobiles, and I'm still not, actually, even though I've worked in railways and I've worked in aviation most of my life. I've no interest in planes whatsoever. I'm only interested in people and the systems that they find themselves in. So that led me to study psychology. And from there, I studied as a master degree ergonomics and human factors. And it was probably some way through my first degree that I found a book on human error by James Reason. And I found work on human error by Donald Norman, who works more in the design space. So you have this safety professor and design specialist there, both looking at human error. I just thought this was absolutely fascinating. I thought this was incredible. And perhaps it answered a lot of questions, really, that you could look at this phenomenon of why people make mistakes, how they make mistakes from lots of different angles. So, as I say, through my master degree, I studied it in more depth, and then I went on to do a PhD on human factors in air traffic control. And that was really developing a classification system for errors and those factors that influence errors. So that in itself it's a sort of collecting behavior. As I look back now, it's really analyzing how things go wrong, how people end up doing, saying, hearing things in ways that they didn't expect or imagine, and then applying taxonomy and taxonomic science to that. So that took me to my PhD. And I did my PhD actually over 6 years or so while I was working. But it was an early fascination in human behavior, and I've still got it. I've never lost it. I still find people the most fascinating things in the world.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you didn't state that I'll state for you, and it's this idea that you've recognized you've had this diagnosis at 49 of being autistic. Now, that's usually regarded as a deficit. Yet, when we take a strengths-based approach, we say, well, actually, that's the thing that gives you the superpower in pattern recognition, and also intuitively recognizing that you want to understand people because that's not your natural, obvious way to go. But when you start taking a patterning approach to it, things start to make sense, people start to make sense, and the natural relationship of that to systems. So I'm really interested in this, that kind of parallel, which I think is really beautiful. Just thinking about, you mentioned these couple of books, on human error and how they were just inspirational to you. Just going to practical experience now. What sort of practical experiences have you had that also inform your way of thinking now? What have you learned through experiential?
Well, I guess when I started off working in an air traffic control organisation in the UK, I continued down this line of analysing incidents, and it's a sort of dissection approach, of looking at incidents. It's extracting the errors, at least from my point of view, extracting the influencing factors, the performance influencing factors, we sometimes call them performance shaping factors, contextual conditions, and so on, the things that influence the errors, and then analysing those, looking at the interactions and so on. But I sometimes call it error taxidermy. It's extracting the errors and paying close attention to them and the things that influence those errors, and then forming some kind of looking at patterns across data sets. That was one of the first things that I got involved in, but that was really, again, it was part of my PhD, if you like. It also involved sitting in simulators, observing air traffic controllers. So I spent a long time doing that, many weeks doing that. So that would be observing manual interaction errors with interfaces, things that you could see. Obviously not, you can't observe things you can't see. So that would be observing things like button presses and so on in task sequences, knowing what should come next. And then also interviewing people. So interviewing people after they've had incidents, interviewing people using the critical incident technique, where you ask them to bring to mind a critical incident that they've had. So using a variety of approaches to look at it from different perspectives, different points of view. But again, that all started with that very much deficit-based approach. But what I was interested in primarily is what goes wrong, what went wrong, and why and how things went wrong, which was really the dominant paradigm and still is. It's how human beings contribute to risk.
I'm really interested. I'm currently doing a bit of a deep dive into looking at risk and safety events from moving from taxonomies to topologies. They're starting to look at you used words like influencing factors. I would call them dispositional risk factors. What is it about the system that we could modulate or change that might touch on many, many risks or safety events. An example in a health system, for example, might be the retention of experienced staff. They've got massive churn. As a risk mitigation, the biggest risk in health at the moment for many organisations is just keeping their good people and not having them walk out the door. And when you do that, then that affects all of the sorts of safety events, regardless of the taxonomy. So it's a different level. So I just wonder, have you had much thinking around that sort of distinction of moving from that taxonomy to more topology?
Well, I must say, once you've done a PhD in taxonomy, you spent a lot of years thinking about that. You don't really want to ever think about it again. So, very quickly not very quickly, but, I think the thing is, the more time you spend studying something and you become an expert in it, let's say, of course, you're going to get a little bit stuck in that for all sorts of reasons. You're good at it and you've got a lot of information, a lot of knowledge. But that was just one of the things that I was doing. And I think what I realized was that there wasn't really very much systems thinking in it. That it's more of a mechanical approach. And this approach really comes from mechanics. It comes from engineering. That a component has failed. But of course, something like a poor maintenance schedule has influenced that failure, or the wrong component, substandard component, something like that. So that's just an analogy for the way human error was treated. Now, human factors is by definition a systems discipline, but a lot of work in human factors really isn't very systemic and doesn't take much account of complexity. There are some difficulties, when you start to look at interactions and complexity. So, for instance, you mentioned staff retention. In human factors and psychology, we try to take a scientific approach, as much as possible. So when you start looking at these, what James Reason called latent errors, or these distal factors, whatever words you want to use to talk about the same thing, it's quite difficult to prove causation. It's quite difficult. And that's why we don't tend to use the word cause for those distal features. Whereas when there's something like a mistake by a frontline actor, then the word cause just comes to mind very easily, because you press the button and that caused this interaction with the system, whatever. So we're quite happy to use the word cause there. But then once it goes back to things like social pressure, beyond the sort of supervisory level or even the team level, but once you get to that level, because there's no physical cause and effect, we're not comfortable using that term. And so we start to think of other terms like influences and so on. So we don't treat all things fairly. And that in itself is quite unfair, because as you get down to the frontline actor, their range of possibilities narrows. And that one of the reasons for that is that they're under quite often incredible time pressure. And they're often left with two decisions, two options. It might be three, but very often there are, do you do it or do you not do it? And you've got 3 seconds to decide. So that's the difference. Whereas going back in time, when you take the example that you mentioned of like staff availability, well, there were lots of options at the time as to what you could do there about staffing decisions. And there were constraints as well. The constraint to make it very difficult. But there's lots of time and there are more options. And then as you get closer and closer to what we sometimes call the sharp end, you've got fewer and fewer options and less time. And yet, it's only at that point that we use the word cause and not earlier on. And I think another interesting thing about that is the role of omissions, where somebody does not do something. So let's say it could be a controller, it could be a pilot, a surgeon, it could be a firefighter, it could be a paramedic, it could be anyone, does not do something. But there's something that, let's say in hindsight, now with all of the facts they should have done, but they didn't do. Well, when you go back, you might say, well, was any kind of assessment done of this task from a human performance point of view? right? To see, is this a task that a reasonably trained and competent person can reasonably achieve with very high levels of reliability? So if a train driver has to brake at a certain section of track, as happened in Santiago de Compostela in Spain in 2013, for instance, and they have to brake and they have a very short time to brake, otherwise the train will leave the tracks and it will derail and crash. And the train driver does not brake, which happened in that case, going from a high-speed section of track under automated stopping, let's say, braking, for general listeners, to a section of track where they had to slow down and brake manually very quickly. So two different modes. And if that driver doesn't brake, which that one did not, then you can say, well, it's obvious that the crash happened because the driver did not brake. I mean, that's sort of logic, really, and you can't argue with it. But so there's an omission there, but there's another omission that I would want to ask, well, did the organization do an assessment to show beyond reasonable doubt that this was a reasonable task for a trained and competent driver to do? And the answer to that is almost always no. So which is worse? Because one influences, I think you mentioned earlier, that failure to do that assessment influences hundreds of drivers and thousands of journeys. The other is just one journey over the course of seconds or a minute or two.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I really like the way that you articulate that. And there's a key word there that I use a lot, which is reasonable. In the context, is it reasonable? And often when you ask that in context, the answer goes from that focus on that person made the error to it was just not a reasonable situation to be in.
Right.
I think that's beautifully articulated.
Well, it's a test in law as well, the reasonable person test, and it's a test in law for a reason. And so it does make sense to look at it that way. But of course, this is an argument about what is reasonable to whom.
Yeah, we're starting to get into some language now, like reasonable, challenging causation within the system. As you said, at the pointy end, we might go there, but as we become more distal, then that's not an appropriate term. And in fact, I would argue that in any complex system, it's an error, whilst focusing on errors, to go into root cause analysis at all. Analysing the dispositional risk factors and what went on, yeah, absolutely, we have to learn. But getting away from this idea, I need to do a root cause analysis. Fine, if your factory breaks down somewhere, great, do root cause analysis. But in these systems with humans making decisions and pressing buttons under pressure, it's not the right approach. It ends up with blame. And I think language matters. And I'm interested now to move from this deficit-focused language to neutralized taxonomy. Can you tell me a little bit about both and the benefits of neutralized taxonomy?
Okay, so a taxonomy is a system hierarchically based of terms, concepts, definitions to comprehensively describe a phenomenon. And there's various criteria for that. So it should be comprehensive. It should be able to classify all or almost all of what it's trying to classify. And it should be able to be used reliably in practice if you're going to use this in practice. So if you and I classify the same thing, we should be using the same terms. That feature, there are a few other features, but that particular feature is much more difficult. When I developed this system, which was called Tracer, the technique for the retrospective and predictive analysis of cognitive errors. When I developed that system, it was rolled out across Europe ultimately in a different name. So we converted it to some changes were made. It was made into a different name, and it still is there today. So you can recognize the structure of it. There've been lots of changes and so on. People were always adding new influencing factors and so on. That happens, it grows organically and so on. I think what I realized though, looking at it was, wow, this all of this taxonomy, and most of it, can only describe a small amount of activity because it's negatively focused, especially when it comes to the human being. So an example would be mishear, like if I mishear you, or if I missee something, or I misperceive, or make a misjudgment, or make an incorrect decision. Those are at the level of, at the sort of cognitive level, if you like. And then at the team level, there would be things like poor supervision and inadequate teamwork. And you see these terms, they're standards. So a very well-known taxonomy is called HFACS, Human Factors Analysis Classification System, I think it is. That's been around a long time. It's not just that one. Most of these taxonomies are completely deficit-based. They're all negative language. What that means is you cannot use it to describe normal, everyday work where things are not going wrong. And you cannot use it to describe recovery actions. How do people recover so that an accident doesn't ultimately occur? In air traffic, we have very few accidents, almost not, that are ATC responsible. Most of what we have is losses of separation between aircraft. And so in the end, there's often a recovery action. So to me, it was like, this is a waste, because we could be using the taxonomy just to describe everything. That's what goes wrong, what goes right, and just what goes on more generally, just what goes on. And so I just did something quite simple, which was to remove the adjectives, the qualifiers. So instead of inadequate decision, it would just be decision. Instead of poor teamwork, it would be teamwork, and instead of inadequate supervision, it would just be supervision. So what that means then is you've got a bunch of words that help you to not only describe phenomena after the fact, but have conversations about them, right? So I might have an incident report, and I could say there's something here that's to do with a decision. I mean, that's for sure. I don't want to pre-label it as inadequate. I just want to have a conversation and think about this decision in context of everything that was going on. Because it's not a decision that was taken with the aim of it going wrong. It was a decision that was taken with the aim of it going right. And for reasons, the ultimate consequence was not as the person imagined or wanted. So it enables you to do that, and it also enables you to have a conversation, because when you're talking to people, if you're asking questions that are deficit-based and quite loaded, of course you're going to get a more negative reaction. And I found that in my PhD. You've got this young person coming along in their early 20s, talking to someone now my age, like in the 50s or whatever, and you're asking them about why they made a poor decision. That's not a good conversation. Whereas if you have a conversation about decision-making, well, you can talk all day about that. There are lots of things that influence decisions and so on. And there's, and so you can apply that across the whole taxonomy, so that's what I did. And that was really at the start of getting into more involved in systems ergonomics, systems thinking, and then later safety too, which is this alternative perspective on safety that was proposed by Eric Holnagel.
I'm curious, have you come across a modality called clean language in your experiences?
Yes, but not in human factors specifically.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with clean language. Yeah,
right. Parallels. Yeah.
Yeah, that precision of not leading and allowing to emerge and gathering information in a non-judgmental, non-leading way, neither poor nor good, very neutral. I like this. You triggered a thought there for me when you started talking about when we have a negative language, we suggestion that you will be traumatized or stressed, I think is extremely harmful. And it's interesting now that there are people feeling guilty for being okay after a critical incident because they feel like they should be traumatized because everyone's saying they should be traumatized. And they go, well, actually, I feel okay. Is there something wrong with me? Because I've just been witness to a car accident and 3 people are dead, but I'm actually feeling all right. But then they start feeling guilty. And, we almost have to rebalance. It used to be no one could talk about feeling, being unwell or being traumatized. And now you can't talk about being okay. So I think it's got to swing back into that neutral zone again, where it's okay to be okay and it's okay to actually not be okay. Either we need to work with what we've got, but always paying attention back to that recovery process and that strength, that benefit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but this is not only kind of revealed because I talked about this publicly a few times and written about it, but I was diagnosed some years ago with PTSD, which was a real complex chronic thing lasting, over 20 years, probably more like 25 to 30 years, something like that. A series of events. Also, going back to how I started, also being autistic. Autistic people are much more, turns out they're more susceptible to PTSD, the way the brain processes trauma and events. But yeah, I absolutely agree about that. One thing that we do know is that what can be quite a bad idea in traumatizing situations or traumatic situations, there's a difference between that and PTSD. So there's a difference between post-traumatic stress and PTSD. There's a big difference. So situations have the potential to be traumatic. A mistake that you can make is putting someone in front of a psychologist. And I think for those reasons, we used to think that was a good idea. But in fact, what the psychologist can do, and this is going back in some time, is start to describe lots of symptoms. But we already know from psychology that there's a sort of demand effect in that, and so it's like, okay, is this what I'm thinking? Was that a nightmare, which, your brain is naturally predisposed to process things in your sleep. And then you're sort of perhaps fearful of going to sleep because you fear that another nightmare and so on. So there is a sort of suggestibility. And one of the best things you can do is for people to be part of their natural social network, their family, friends, colleagues, and so on. And as you say, without any expectation that things might go one way or the other, but that people can keep an eye on each other. So yes, there's a sort of priming risk in what you're talking about. I'd agree.
Absolutely. Priming risk, suggestibility. And I really endorse what you said about natural social networks and the healing power of that, of community and being able to process in idiosyncratic ways. I think there's two other interesting things that you said. One is, I had this diagnosis 20 to 30 years, it's a long time. And it's in the past. This idea that the body keeps the score. Well, I think it might keep the score for a period of time, but we have to focus on the fact that we can get it out. We can release this. We can move on. We can go, actually, when I do a scan of my body, I don't have trauma anymore. And that's a really important message. I think there's another thing which is interesting when you say traumatic situations. Like the linguistics of that say, well, the situation is causal for trauma. When in fact what we've got are traumatic responses to situations. And when we do that, we insert response and we have a gap then between the environment and our response. And that gap is the key. We need to pay attention to that gap and not describe situations as traumatic, but as this is now a situation where we need to design our interventions so that we don't end up with everybody going, I'm all traumatized. So, yeah, interesting, isn't it? Just those subtle words, the implication of causation in there.
I guess I see myself as part of the situation, but it doesn't have to be traumatic. And what's traumatic to one person absolutely isn't to another. And I've got, a friend working in pediatric ICU, and to me, it's sort of astonishing. I know a lot of medics and nurses and so on, and it's quite amazing to me, being a very, very sensitive person, very emotionally empathic. I've been in a medical simulation, for instance, watching a recreation of what was actually a very famous accident, well-known accident that was pediatric. And of course, there's no person there. There's no actual person there. It's a simulation. And I found this very emotional. I found this, I could hardly get through it without crying, because to me, I just know that situation did happen. Yeah. So, but I'm just much more predisposed to that, being much more probably emotionally sensitive and empathic in terms of my nervous system. Other people, they just went through it and then they just debriefed it. They just discussed it. You know, the medics, they were urological surgeons and let's say trainees. They're still very experienced, actually, just not consultant level, you know, and so on. They didn't find it that way. You know, they thought the case is very sad, of course, but what they're involved, you can't be involved in something like that and to be very upset at the same time. That's not going to work. You know, you just can't. And you've got to, and so, as I say, I know a few people who work in pediatric intensive care, and they've witnessed children dying. Of course they have. Of course they have. And they've got to carry on, and they do carry on, and they develop socially, interpersonally, psychically, lots of ways of
You know, even going through rituals like grief and training people and saying, hey, what I'm seeing here, I wonder, have you actually had an opportunity to grieve or have a process? Because sometimes it's the ritual, which is all that you need to be able to process and move on. But if we just slam people straight after, you know, one incident after another, then that's where you get that cumulative build-up and people go over the edge. I've seen this very recently.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's. I mean, you mentioned about getting past PTSD, and I'm now in a fortunate position that I am past PTSD. I can say that I believe I'm post PTSD. A few things happened since that, and this is over the last few years. One, I did grieve. You know, I spent a lot of time grieving in a sense, and it was grieving a time that shouldn't have happened and that was lost in a sense, because so many things went on. So I'm talking about things that were a lot of violence, a lot of quite violent events over quite a long time, plus death and other things without going into details, you know, but a lot of different things. I processed that actually partly through therapy, but partly through music. I found a lot of different types of music that allowed me to process emotion much actually more effective than therapy, because therapy for me is a very cognitive process, and that might be because I'm an autistic person. And I think therapists found me a little bit, I don't want to say intimidating, but one couldn't find a better word, you know, because I already knew everything. I already knew everything about PTSD. I knew everything. I'd read all of the books and everything, and I knew everything about my own experiences. But the emotional part was the block. And so I think that's true. You've got to process the grief of whatever happened, of lost time, of lost years, and you know, and everything else. And then you can get past it. The other thing is, if you are neurodivergent. So in my industry, right, in aviation, as you can imagine, among pilots, there are a lot of autistic people. They just are. They weren't fascinated with people like I was. That was my special interest. They were fascinated by planes. And there are a lot of controllers as well. And they are absolutely exceptional. They're absolutely brilliant. I also believe you have a lot of people with ADHD. That's because I've got a family full of autistic and ADHD people and I can spot them a mile off. Okay. So you have them as well. And you think, what? You've got people with ADHD doing these jobs? Yeah, because they're absolutely brilliant at it. They are super focused. They can be absolutely brilliant at it. But the point there is that sometimes you can be diagnosed with trauma, like PTSD, and that can be true, but that could be overlaid onto neurodivergence. And it starts to, you're not really sure where one starts and one ends, and it might actually be more than neurodivergent. So like the analogy that I give is if you get a load of blue beads and then a load of red beads and you put them all into a big pot and you mix them up, you've just got some purple beads when you take it from a distance. You can't see what it is. And then, so it's hard to see where one, but there's actually two things there. There's two separate things there. And so you've got to process the trauma from the point of view of being ADHD or of being autistic or of being whatever else it was. You were dyslexic and you went through school and you were called all sorts of names, whatever it was. You've actually got, and then you can develop, now I see why I responded like that. And now I can see why I find these situations threatening now. A weird thing happens that a lot of things start to dissolve away over time. But knowing that really helps. Otherwise, you're just lost in confusion.
There's two things happened here in our conversation. One is there is another expression of the pattern that we're talking about, which is people embodied within systems. And in this case, the pattern is PTSD within the broader dispositional nature of autism, ADHD, neurodivergency. And it's that kind of, treating the whole, but also paying attention and being able to come in and out. I think there's something else as well, which is the again, it's going from the deficit, ADHD. I would meet any formal definition. I've not been diagnosed, but you look at my behaviours and you look at, some of the things you do online, you go, I'm off the chart for ADHD. My eldest is the same, right? But what we have is this ability to hyper-focus. That most of the time we're scattered all over the place until something fascinates us. And if we're fascinated by it, it's like, this is all I really care about right now. And I can hyper-focus to a point of, everyone's going, wow, how have you gone so deep into there? So again, it's that we've got this deficit and we've got this positivity, but let's have the reframe. And this is my big concern around so many medications for things like ADHD. Are we actually taking away the genius here? Are we taking away the benefit by tranquilizing somebody and suppressing? Instead, should we be thinking about reasonable adjustment as a behavior modification? Those sorts of things I think are far, far kinder and also allow that other to come out and be so successful. So,
yeah, I mean, on that, there's a lot of this runs in my family, and I disagree on the medication, and that's because the difference that I've seen with stimulants, so this is a little bit off topic here, but the difference that I've seen with stimulants with ADHD is night and day, and I've spoken to psychiatrists as well. I've witnessed assessments and so on in the family, and I've witnessed the effect of stimulant. So the special interests remain. All of that, the hyper focus, that never goes away. You're with that. That's your gift. But the procrastination, the very scattered attention, the constant dialogue, the shame around not being able to get things started or finished, that disappears. I guess it's about having the right kind of medication. But there's also, as well as that, with autism, there is no medication. There's nothing to cure, in effect. It's just the way that your brain is wired. There's just a reasonable adjustment, and that's true. That's absolutely true. And that's why I talk about it quite openly now, because I think, I've got a daughter that's ADHD, I've got a daughter that's autistic. I've got, going without revealing everybody else, up and out in my family, almost everybody that I can think of is autistic and ADHD. Some are diagnosed and some are not. Some are just obvious, So it's knowing it. That's the most important thing. whether you're formally diagnosed or whether you self-suspect, which I wouldn't use the term self-diagnosis. I don't think that's appropriate, because diagnosis is it's a medical, very technical thing. A lot of work has gone into the instruments to diagnose. They are observational, they're self-report, they are questionnaires, interviews, and so on. So I self-suspected, and that's why I got diagnosed. It doesn't change the fact that I was autistic all the way along, and the same for my relatives. It doesn't change that. But those accommodations. But the one thing I want to say out there, those accommodations are important, but recognizing it yourself and having the self-compassion is it's equally important. It's equally important.
Yeah, I've seen both with the medication around ADHD. I've seen people who do, use this in a temporary acting way. For example, I want to get my accounts done. So incredibly boring. So pop a pill, we get down, get the job done. I'm not procrastinating. I'm functional. But then it wears off, and I can have the advantages of multiple curiosities, and then I can go hyper-focus over here. And, so you can have the benefits of both. So I agree with that. What I was alluding to was where it goes into heavy-handed, and it takes out the genius expression to try and get some kind of normality, when who wants to be normal? Like, really, it's the extraordinary that we should be treasuring as well. So I take your point, though, that in context, we can have the benefit. I like this as well, this idea of this self-compassion. And I think that comes back to this idea of the use of language, this neutralizing language, this idea of just culture, where we're taking a more compassionate approach. We're not looking to blame people so much anymore. Though I do have a question about that. From your experience, are we moving towards a more just culture, or are we still anchored in blame in organizations where they're doing, they're looking at incidents like safety? We've just had take example, the Bayesian sinking recently. What's your perspective there? Do you think are they looking at people in context, do you think, or are they looking to blame? What's your experience? Where are we as a culture?
I think we're always fighting our instinct with this idea. If you got rid of all writings and all ideas about blame, accountability, I think we would just default back to blaming people all the time. So I think that's the default. And I think that starts in the home. It's the first thing, it's one of the first things that we witness, as an infant. When you do something wrong, you're punished. And when you say do something wrong, you don't know that it's wrong. You don't know that if you just push that cup off and it falls onto the floor and breaks, you don't know that that's wrong until you're taught. So that applies throughout the animal kingdom, probably. I mean, certainly if you observe like a dog with her pups, or a lioness with her cubs, you see the disciplining process, and it could be quite harsh. And so we experience that, and so we grow up with that. In a sort of simple situation, it works, and it's necessary. The problem is when you get into complex situations, organizations, safety critical industries, where you don't have this linear causation anymore that's valid, and where things can go very, very badly wrong, and hundreds of people potentially can be injured or harmed or even killed. Then it doesn't work, because these sorts of systems should be very heavily defended, and they're not always. They should be very heavily defended against very significant harm and accidents, but they're not. So that's essentially why you've got to treat them quite differently. And it also depends on the culture. Some cultures are much more emphasize personal responsibility. Some cultures much more emphasize collective responsibility, and so on. So you're not going to override that. You've just got to work with it. You've got to work with it. And so sometimes if we try to take these very Western ideas into cultures where that's not a natural fit, then that's not really going to work either.
Yeah, absolutely. I've recently had this conversation with some people comparing East and West around risk and innovation and decision-making, complexity, reductionist, and trying to marry cultures across East and West, in a business, for example, in a merger or acquisition. There's a lot you said there that I'm really interested in. That we have an instinct to blame. It's grounded in the way we raise our children. In fact, animals do this. And you talked about systems, that where the consequences are so high that we have to defend and really manage that. And this brings me to the question of weak signals. So this early pattern detection. Your particular emphasis is on patterning. When I think about a pattern, is we want those early signals, and it's partly why we're called the Salience Podcast. It's trying to pull out from all the noise. What are the gems here that make a difference in the world, and what are the things that we notice that you go, if I pay attention to that now, that's where we have the leverage. And I'm curious, just thinking about the sorts of weak signals that you might be tuning into anywhere in the world, or in business, or in aviation, or in human factors. What is it? What kind of weak signals are you going, that's got my attention. I don't know where that's going yet, but that's got my attention. Is there anything there for you?
I think the signals at the moment are so overwhelmingly strong. I'm paying a lot of attention to global conflict, and the signals are just so overwhelmingly strong. There's not that much bandwidth for weak signals for me, just because we're bombarded with such strong ones, I suppose. But I'm without going into any particular conflict and global problem, I'm interested in the history of it, because you've got to understand, you've got to roll back to understand, well, how did we get here? How did we get here over decades and sometimes much longer than that? You might then find the weak signals, if you like, looking back. But I'm more interested in where are we now, because this is the situation now. We certainly can't roll back time. We can't do that. And the thing I guess I'm most interested in there is this idea of perspective taking and cognitive empathy and emotional empathy as well. But this idea of perspective taking. And again, it might be because, being a neurodivergent person, for me, perspective taking is a very deliberate activity. It's something I do a lot. And it's absolutely essential to my being in the world. And then it was from a very young age. Like, why are these people suddenly angry? Why are people behaving like this? You still might not find any sense in it from your point of view. But that's certainly something that we need to spend a lot more time doing, is perspective taking, putting ourselves in the point of view of somebody else, putting ourselves not only in terms of what they experience now, but their own history, because we've all had these histories and experiences, and so I'm fascinated in that. I do a lot of group work actually, with people. I do a tremendous amount of group work with groups about safety and organizational culture and so on, and get them in a room. And so I spend a lot of time trying to understand people's point of views. And often they've not really elucidated it. They've not thought about it particularly clearly until they start to verbalize it. And then someone else will say, "Oh, I didn't know that you thought that. I didn't know that's how you saw the situation." And it's only when you really start talking in a way that you reveal your thoughts and you reveal your perspective. And I guess something I've done over the years is become quite skilled in asking questions to get people to talk as much as possible, which is what you do, as a podcaster. So that's I think what's important, that we just spend time putting ourselves in each other's positions. And you can do wonders with that. It's not on the level of global politics, then in your own home. you can in terms of resolving conflicts and getting more productive sort of healthy way of living.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly about the importance of different perspectives. In fact, if I reflect, all of our training programs are underpinned by what we'd call different perspectives or perceptual positions. So self-awareness, first person; second person, empathy, the ability to walk in someone else's shoes, preferably without traumatizing yourself. So have some filters in place. And then that third person, the ability to look back at yourself and the other and make a decision of integrating, and all of this, of course, in context. That person's relationship to this context, me relating to that context. So I agree. It is a fundamental skill, and being able to do that and ask that question. You said, how did we get here, and where do we go next? From those multiple perspectives is a beautiful place to start, I think. And on that, I've got one more question. Thinking a little bit about where we've gone and where you began with autism and patterns and this passion for systems that you still have. What's next for you? What's next for Stephen? Future aspirations, work, or life?
Well, I'm just interested in where my creativity takes me. So I wonder, when you ask neurodivergent people that question, whether they really have a plan, because I've never worked according to a plan. I've had short-term things that I want to achieve. But as an example, when I moved to Australia and I was in my, how old would I have been? I was in my 20s, late 20s. And someone from the university just, we were emailing each other over something, and he just happened to say, it was Graham Braithwaite. He's the head of he's in Cranfield at the moment, head of transportation, I think. And he just said, I don't suppose you'd want to come over to do a lecturing position over here. I was not seeking that. I was a consultant. I was working in the chemical industry and so on. And I just mentioned it at the time to my partner. She said, yeah. And within about 6 months, I think we were there. That was never part of a plan. It was never a plan to live in France, ever. I mean, I dropped French at 14 years old because I thought, and I convinced my head of year at this, I will never, ever need French. I don't need it. I'm interested in the humanities. I'm deeply interested in history, in design, art, and so on. I'll never need it. And they said, okay, you can drop it at age 14. And now, work in France, and I've got a French partner, and I'm still not good at French. So I don't have plans. But I'm a very creative person I found myself in science, but ultimately I'm a creative person who's interested in creating things in all sorts of ways: writing, arts, music, making, production, and so that naturally ignites my passion. So making magazines, for instance, is something that's a creative act. Being an editor seems quite technical, but actually I'm involved in all aspects of making the magazine. And that was something that I was interested in at A-levels. That was one of my projects in communication studies, was making a magazine. And so that creativity, that's the nature of creativity. It will just take me to the next thing. One of the recent projects has been making beer mats, for instance, to help understand different proxies for human work, and doing that through beer mats. And doing it with beer, if that's the way that we want to do it, So you've got work as done in one beer mat, work as imagined, that's another, work as prescribed, and so on. I've made videos of a Ron Kidney operation, all sorts of things. If it involves creativity, I'm up for it. I'm interested.
Yeah, we spoke earlier, just before we hopped on this podcast, about the parallels with our connections to the UK, France, and Australia. And I just laughed then when you said you dropped French at 14. I did exactly the same thing. I thought, I'm never going to need this. It's a waste of time. And then I ended up living in France and going there and renovating a house. And every time I had to order a piece of masonry or deal with plumbing, I went, why did I drop French?
The fear. The fear. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's funny. So many parallels in the way that we're thinking, approaching language and safety and across different domains. I've taken today lots of points. If I had to summarize 3 that really stand out, it's the strength of the pattern analysis and its connection to systems. So people and patterns and systems, and how that manifests through so many domains and so many ways of thinking, from therapy and trauma to aviation safety and critical incident debriefs. A lot on the language and this, not causal, particularly when we're dealing with distal things, thinking about what's reasonable in context and, how that underpins just culture. I really like that term, reasonable, and the neutralizing language, of course. And then I've got a final takeaway, which is, what we're inherently biased towards, or we have this instinct for blame and accountability. And I think like you were saying about diagnosis of ADHD or autism, being aware that we have an instinct for that, even though it might not be useful or the best way to view it. Let's be aware that cognitive and social bias is there, and then let's work more productively, I think was a message I took from that. So they're my 3 salient points. Is there anything else you'd like to end with? Any other?
Well, I just like the point you made about, using the neutralized language for the self as well. And, extending that this isn't just about organizations. It's just about the way you pay attention to language. As Ludwig Wittgenstein, famous philosopher, Austrian philosopher, said that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. All I know is what I have words for. And the way that we think in words affects us all, it affects organizations. And so that's worth paying attention to.
That is a great ending for the podcast. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ian.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.